going to offer two keys that'll help us unlock something of the psychological horror within the movie, The Substance. Clearly, this is a film that falls within the genre of body horror, but I'm going to argue that there's more than two perhaps, crucial psychological themes that really open up this horror and make it somehow viable. I'm also going to put forward the argument that The Substance is a kind of fairy tale horror movie of our times. So let's start with an observation, maybe that is sometimes missed when people talk about the film and its more visceral, gross bodily horror elements. And that observation is that our key protagonist, Lizzie, is very much alone. She's isolated, she's alienated in the film. After she is fired by Harvey on her 50th birthday from her exercise aerobics program that presumably has brought her a lot of fame, we see her in a couple of scenes in her apartment, and there's some worker there who seems to be helping her out, but we don't get a sense that she has any possible viable social relationship, no friends, no partner, no family. These things are just not within the universe of possibility for Lizzie. And we could say, well, why is that? Why is it that she seems to be so alone? Other than this rather alienating and horrible experience with Harvey, who kind of fires her, there seems to be very few people that she has any social interaction with. Of course, you could say the one exception to the rule is when Fred arrives and he meets her. Also, I believe, on the same day that she's going through all of these difficult situations. And she seems genuinely puzzled, genuinely befuddled as to what to even do with this guy. She can't remember him. He was in elementary school or middle school with her. And it's not just a case of, oh, I don't really like this guy. I don't really want to go out on a date with him. Because later on, she seems to want to reconsider. But it's almost as if it's just not in the world of possibility for Lizzie to have a kind of social relationship with someone. Now, what has taken the place? What is it that makes it not necessary for her to have any of these kinds of social relationships? And you could say, well, one reason is that she really does have a relationship, a very significant, loving, narcissistic relationship, maybe also an aggressive relationship, and that's a relationship with her own image. And we see this replayed over and over again in the first half an hour of the film. We see her walking down a corridor, which has got multiple different posters of years that her TV show has been running. We see her in billboards. We see that in her room, in her house. The key image, the biggest image within the entire house, is a kind of idealized image of herself, which is up on the wall. It's all in blue, and there are moments in the film where this image seems to look back upon her. Now, we're often used to thinking about the male gaze, and of course you could say that there's facets of patriarchal male gaze within the film. But what is also kind of interesting is that you could say maybe one of the most punitive and aggressive gazes within the film itself comes from her own idealized image. Now, immediately, we also are reminded that this idealized image, which has presumably played quite a comforting, supportive, affirming role through much of her career, it's worked for a long time, and now at the strike of her 50th birthday, things seem to go wrong. The image, the gap between her and this idealized image, which has always been so supportive and affirming, now starts to open up. It's almost as if the ideal image has taken on a life of its own. And once she takes the substance and we see the birth, so to speak, of Sue coming out of her body, Sue now becomes a literal embodiment of the idealized image with whom she has increasing conflict. But let's just remember two scenes of conflict or aggressivity that seem to emerge in her relationship with her image. There is the scene when she is back home. She looks at the snow globe of Lizzie, Elizabeth Sparkle. She gets upset and she throws it, and it hits this huge portrait, idealized portrait of her in her apartment. It leaves this ugly smear, but the scene remains with this idealized image gazing back at her. So what we are essentially saying is that in the place where there may have been more vital, more spontaneous lived social relationships, either with peers, with another person, with friends, or with family, what Lizzie has instead is a kind of mirror relationship, an ego's relationship to its mirror other. We may also then at this point, and this is why I suggested we're dealing with a kind of horror fairy tale, ask ourselves, well, what other correlates, what other historical precedents to this kind of image, to this kind of crisis do we find in the history of cinema? And of course, it would go back even beyond the history of cinema, but we could say, well, excuse me for making this suggestion, but isn't this whole film in a way a kind of dramatization of the Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs Wicked Witch looking in the mirror scene? Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of us all? And the mirror then shows a much fairer, a much more beautiful, and I'm guessing a much younger Snow White figure that the Wicked Witch then wants to kill. So we have a very neat way of expressing both the desire for an image, an idealized image of me that is more beautiful, that in some ways is more enticing, more narcissistically affirming than my own physicality. But not only does one desire this image, and let's bear in mind that Lizzie risks a great deal to go and get this substance, this yellowish formula, which she then injects such that there's a transformation in her body, such that she gives birth, so to speak, to another part of her. But it is also the case that she risks a great deal, that she desires to be or to live up to the idealized image. But this idealized image, once it's taken on a life of its own, also represents a rival, someone with whom one has a lethal kind of relationship. And I think the film does a nice job of showing the lethal potentiality of images when we see right at the beginning, she gets fired from her job, she's driving in a car, she looks up, she sees a huge, quite glamorous billboard, which of course has her own face on it. The workmen up there who are working on it pull the sign down, it's nicely torn right through the middle of the image. She's fixated and appalled by this, and a car hits her and she's nearly killed, which sets up a nice equation between the image and its lethal potential.
Have you ever dreamt of a better version of yourself?
Now, what else can we say? Not only have we said that the image gazes back upon her and that there's a certain lethal relationship to the image, but we can also say that this image and this narcissistic relationship to the ideal image squeezes out and makes not possible a whole variety of other relations. I've made that point already. But here's a kind of interesting thought. We see the motif of the image in a very sort of artificial way come back right at the end of the film when Lizzie and Sue have kind of morphed into this monstrous hybrid of themselves. And you'll remember that what happens at this point in the film is that Sue, who now is kind of taken over, the ideal, much younger, skinnier, sexier version, has to appear at this spectacle, this New Year's Eve spectacle, and her image, her body starts to deteriorate. There's a moment when she is trying to get rid of Lizzie. Lizzie also is trying to get rid of Sue. They have an extended fight, but at some point they kind of both morph into each other. And then in this kind of parody moment, this monstrous figure has, you guessed it, an image pinned onto her or its head, and it's an image of the former Lizzie. So there's a kind of nice way of emphasizing the superficiality of the image, which is still the thing that one is striving for. But now a question opens up for us that again is less than obvious. We spend a lot of time in the body horror genre being appalled by the grossness of this body opening, the spinal cut, out come the elbows, and out emerges Sue. And then eventually we have to sew up the other body again. Now you could say that's just kind of gross and it's kind of appalling, and that's partly why we watch films like this. But I think it's also a nice material instantiation of the idea of what happens when one's ideal image takes on a life of its own. You could say that's the true psychological horror underlying the visceral horror of this bodily scene. But something else that seems to get missed there is if there's a whole series of social relations which are foreclosed to Lizzie because of her attachment and her aggressive and amorous relationship to her own idealized image. One of those relations, not just the possible relationship to Fred, but the other relationship that seems to be foreclosed here is the possibility of a kind of vital familiar role. And what seems to be kind of obvious when you think about it again is that the age difference, presumably about 20, 25 years, between Lizzie and Sue is an age difference which suggests that one could be the mother of the other. In other words, you could say, and of course this seems to be borne out by the fact that the one gives birth in a sense to the other. In other words, you could say that Lizzie's preoccupation with her own ideal image in a radicalized way has taken the place of the possibility that she may assume a series of other social relationships, one of which is potentially to be a partner or indeed to be the mother to someone. So that is of interest, but that takes us to, and that's our first key to the film. The key here being that the conflict, the desirous relationship to an image, and the conflict which one can never win, despite that one attempts to do so. This is a kind of psychological or psychoanalytic theme which seems to run throughout the film. And it's worth watching the film again just to see how many of these scenes we have where Lizzie looks at herself in the mirror, where she sizes up her naked bodily self, and of course, which is then echoed when Sue also does the same thing. This conflict between the ego and its own image seems to run throughout the film. That's our first key to thinking about what's going on in the substance. Here's a second one, and I'm going to try to dramatize or demonstrate it for you. Do you remember something like this?
It stops.
Of course, I'm alluding to the character of Harvey. Harvey, what's up with Harvey? So Dennis Quaid plays this character who, in a way, doesn't even seem to be a real character. It's more like a massive one-dimensional caricature of something. But of what? Well, we know he's a pretty vulgar person, by all accounts. He seems to come too close to the camera. He's kind of got this red face. The first time we see him, it's not very long before he's urinating, pretty much actually kind of on top of us, if you consider where the camera is and how his proximity is to the camera. But we also get the scene when he's eating, when they go out for a meal and he's going to fire Lizzie, and we have this slow motion, close-up, gross eating scene where you hear all these squishy sounds and you see him basically stuffing his mouth to some kind of excess. Now, for many people, the first time you watch the film, you think, it's a little overdone. I think I got the point. But actually, the point is that it needs to be overdone because what is Harvey in that moment? In that moment, he seems to be reduced to nothing other than what Freud would call the oral drive. This need to feed the body some kind of unmoderated, unmediated excess pleasure of the body within the oral cavity. And there he goes, eating, dropping food everywhere with very little concern for anyone else around him, with very little concern, you could say, for something like a reality principle, it's all about this oral libidinal excess of feeding. He's the oral drive par excellence. Now, of course, that's not all he is, because then we start to see that later on, he's very keen on, I want sex, I want young woman. And of course, he becomes, as it were, a parody of a patriarchal, idiotic, masculine, whatever, sexual masturbatory enjoyment of sorts. Another way of putting that, we already referred to Freud once before, let's refer back again to Freud. Not only is he an oral drive, because he seems to shift a little bit, sometimes he seems to be more of maybe a phallic drive or something, he seems to be the Freudian id, which is the collection of repressed impulses and wishes that are in him simply realized. Okay, so he has no social niceties and he just wants what he wants. He wants his sexual and bodily pleasures. I want you, he says to Sue at some point. So we get it, right? Here's this id impulse. But where it becomes interesting is we so often think about in the film we think about Sue as the kind of other part of Lizzie. Other part of her. You know, we have the two eggs, all of this stuff, the two that are one, all so on and so forth. The reiteration of a kind of Jekyll and Hyde theme whereby one kind of lives off the other, and then there's some kind of rivalrous, aggressive relationship between the two. But is it not the case in a strange sort of way that Harvey is also a cut-off part of Lizzie? Well, why do I say that? Well, we get the gross eating scene, and then in the next scene or so, when we meet Harvey again, he says goodbye to Lizzie, but he gives her, in an unusual gesture for someone who is kind of id-oriented as he is, you would think that a charitable giving gesture is not within his box of tricks. He gives her what? He gives her a cookery book. And of course, this ends up being a bit of a cursed gift, because what does it indicate to us? Well, it indicates that maybe he is conferring upon her the liberty to simply go ahead and enjoy her own oral drive, her own oral pleasures, which are precisely the thing which have been set aside for so long for her to be a success in her exercise aerobics show, where she's had to look bodily beautiful. So not only do we have the film dramatizing of this gap that widens between Lizzie and her own idealized image, who takes on a life of its own, and that continues to widen. She gets increasingly ugly and aged because when Sue doesn't abide by the 7-day rule of turning back into her, we see that she starts to age dramatically, and she becomes hunched and she becomes deformed. But the other thing which seems so interesting is not only is that the problem, in the time when she is kind of offline, when Sue is living her best life, and indeed having sex and doing the kinds of things that Lizzie is not able to do, what we find is that Lizzie basically pigs out. She kind of relents completely to the oral drive, and then we have that scene, which I'm sure you will remember if you've seen the film, when there is every imaginable kind of food that's scattered in a kind of disgusting way all across the apartment, and you know she has eaten pretty much anything she wants. So we could ask ourselves, is Harvey even a real character, or is Harvey actually simply the displaced oral drive of Lizzie that gets put to one side and then opened up at that moment when she has given up on trying to live up to this image? And then comes a kind of interesting symmetry. We see Harvey as this disgusting person who's representative of nothing other than an excessive drive, whether it's an oral drive or some kind of sexual drive. But we could also ask ourselves a somewhat sobering question, and that is Lizzie herself not subject also to a certain kind of greed? Although this greed, which likewise seems to know no limit, is the greed, the narcissistic greed to have an ideal image that is more beautiful and more appealing than anything that she can muster within herself.